She woke up early on a cold morning, feeling the weight of another day pressing on her shoulders, but determined to keep moving forward because she believed that her voice mattered and that she was meant to do something meaningful with her life, even if the path felt heavy at times, and even if the world sometimes seemed cruel or confusing or full of noise and negativity that tried to drown out every hopeful sound she produced. Her name was Alia, and she was a young woman who had grown up loving books, music, and quiet places where she could hear her thoughts with clarity and imagine futures that looked brighter than the present she lived in. She was not born into fame or wealth or social power, and she never wanted any of those things anyway. She only wanted the chance to speak honestly about what she felt, what she saw, and what she believed could change the world for the better. It started with small videos that she recorded in her bedroom using only a simple phone and a lamp clipped onto an old shelf. Her content was not about makeup or fashion or luxury travel, even though those things dominated the feeds of many other creators. Instead, she talked about confidence, self-worth, the struggle to feel enough, and the pain that lived inside so many people who felt invisible, unheard, or judged by the world. She wanted to give them a voice, or at least make them feel less alone, because she had once felt that way too, and she knew how heavy that feeling could be. At first, only a few people watched her videos, but those few left comments telling her that she had helped them get through a bad day, or reminded them that they deserved kindness and respect, or given them courage to speak up at school or in their own homes. And those messages lit something inside Alia that no amount of discouragement could dim. The internet was huge and messy and sometimes cruel, but it was also full of people who needed connection and support, and she felt called to provide that. As time passed, her account began to grow, and the views increased slowly, then suddenly, and within a few months, thousands of people were watching her content every week. Her words traveled farther than she ever imagined, reaching people in different cities, countries, and cultures who all shared the same hunger for compassion and understanding and community. She was amazed and grateful and sometimes overwhelmed by the attention, but she tried to stay grounded, reminding herself that the real purpose was not to be popular, but to be useful. But the internet is not always kind, and with growth came a new wave of experiences that Alia was not prepared for. One morning, she opened her phone and saw a string of hateful messages flooding her posts, calling her weak, ugly, fake, useless, and other insults that burned across her screen like fire. She stared at them, stunned at first, unsure how strangers could feel so entitled to tear her down when they did not know anything about her life, her struggles, or her intentions. She tried to brush it off, but more came, and then more, and soon the hateful voices echoed louder than the supportive ones, filling her notifications with words that made her chest tighten with anxiety. The trolls questioned her appearance, her voice, her intelligence, her worth, and they did it without hesitation, without empathy, and without understanding the damage they could cause. Or maybe they understood and simply did not care. Alia felt something inside her begin to break, slowly, like thin glass under pressure. She had wanted to help others feel seen, but now she was the one feeling exposed, vulnerable, and attacked. She considered deleting her account, shutting off the internet, and disappearing into silence, where no one could judge her ever again, because the pain of strangers' cruelty felt sharper than she expected, and it made her doubt herself in ways she had not experienced since childhood. For days, her room felt darker and her voice felt smaller, and she wondered if the trolls were right, if maybe she was not strong enough or smart enough or pretty enough to speak publicly or share her feelings or try to help anyone at all. She wondered if the world simply had no place for sensitive people who wanted to heal instead of hurt, who wanted to connect instead of compete, and who wanted to make spaces safer instead of scarier. But then, something unexpected happened. A girl from another country sent her a long message explaining how Alia had given her the courage to talk about her own struggles with bullying and self-esteem, and how her videos had prevented her from making a harmful decision that night. Alia read the message again and again, feeling tears fill her eyes, and suddenly realizing that even in the midst of hatred, her voice had reached someone who truly needed it. Then another message came, then another, and soon she remembered that for every troll, there were dozens of quiet hearts who were listening, healing, and growing because of her willingness to speak openly. Alia realized that the trolls did not hate her personally. They hated the idea of vulnerability, the idea of kindness, the idea of someone telling others they deserved love and respect because those ideas threatened the kind of cruelty they wanted to spread. So Alia made a decision. She would not leave, she would not surrender to the noise, and she would not allow strangers to rewrite her story with their bitterness. Instead, she would learn. She would study cyberbullying, digital harassment, and online hate. She would understand why people behaved this way and what could be done to help victims who suffered silently behind screens while the world ignored their pain. She spent long nights researching, reading articles, watching documentaries, taking notes, and discovering statistics that shook her to her core. Millions of young people around the world suffered from cyberbullying, leading to anxiety, trauma, depression, and even loss of life. And yet so few people took it seriously because the wounds were invisible, because the battlefield was digital, and because adults often underestimated the power of online cruelty. Alia knew then that her mission would not be about videos anymore. It would be about change. It would be about education, awareness, support, and building a movement that could transform digital spaces from hostile war zones into communities of empathy, understanding, and responsibility. She would take the same energy that trolls used to hurt her and convert it into momentum that would help protect and empower others who are fighting alone. And that was the moment the movement truly began, even though no one knew it yet, not even Alia herself. The day Alia decided to fight back against the shadow of online hate, she felt something inside her shift, like a door opening to a world she had never explored before. She was nervous because she did not know what would happen, and she was still hurting from the insults that echoed in her mind whenever she closed her eyes. But she also knew that staying silent would only let the trolls win, and she refused to let cruelty become the loudest voice on the internet. She began by writing down every painful thing she had seen online, not just directed at her, but at thousands of others. People mocked for their looks, mocked for their voices, mocked for their dreams, for their culture, for their gender, for their trauma, and for things they had no control over. The internet was a place where wounds bled quietly, and most people pretended not to see because they feared that speaking up would make them the next target. Alia joined online forums and support groups where victims of cyberbullying shared their stories, and she was stunned by how many were suffering alone. Some were teenagers who felt scared to tell their parents. Some were adults who lost jobs because of targeted harassment. Some were artists who stopped creating because the hate drowned out their passion. They all carried invisible scars, and yet they supported one another with warmth and understanding that the outside world rarely offered. Listening to them changed Alia. Even when her heart ached, she felt energized because she finally understood that this fight was not just about her. It was about every silent voice hiding behind locked screens and dark rooms, wondering if the world still had space for their existence. She promised herself that she would make that space and that she would fill it with kindness, love, and strength. With time, Alia began to speak again, but this time she spoke differently. She made videos about digital empathy, about how words can bruise just like fists, about how online hate has real consequences on real humans who have real lives and dreams. She refused to mention the trolls directly because she did not want to give them power. Instead, she gave power to the victims, helping them recognize that their worth could not be determined by anonymous strangers who hid behind fake names and cruel intentions. The viewers responded in ways she never expected. Messages poured in from people around the world, admitting that her words made them feel seen for the first time. Parents thanked her for helping them understand what their children were going through. Teachers shared her videos in classrooms. Counselors used her stories in workshops and discussions. Alia was humbled by the impact, yet she knew this was only the beginning. Soon, organizations noticed her work and reached out to collaborate. They invited her to online meetings where professionals discussed ways to raise awareness about cyberbullying and digital safety. Aaliyah listened, learned, and shared her perspective as someone who knew the battlefield from the inside. She learned that change required more than emotional support. It required education, legislation, and cultural transformation. At first, she worried that she was not qualified enough because she was not a psychologist or a lawyer or a politician. But the experts reminded her that lived experience was just as valuable and sometimes even more powerful than degrees or titles. Their encouragement gave her confidence, and she began to dream bigger than she had ever had before. One evening, as she sat at her desk surrounded by notebooks, sticky notes, and open tabs on her laptop, she realized that she wanted to build something more than content. She wanted to build a movement, a global one, a movement that could unite people across borders, languages, and backgrounds for one simple mission: to make the digital world safer and kinder for all. She drafted ideas for workshops, school programs, campaigns, hashtags, conferences, partnerships, and support groups. She imagined ambassadors in different countries. She imagined youth leaders. She imagined survivors becoming advocates. She imagined trolls learning empathy and changing because someone told them the truth in a way that pierced through their hardened armor. She was scared of failing, but even more scared of doing nothing, because doing nothing meant letting hate grow unchecked. The thought of that pushed her forward every morning, even when her voice shook, and even when her hands trembled as she typed her plans into documents that no one else had seen yet. Her movement did not have a name yet, but it had a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was strong. Weeks passed as Aaliyah continued shaping the vision of her movement, and she worked late into the night on most days, surrounded by books, articles, interviews, documentaries, and handwritten notes that filled her desk like a map of ideas waiting to be connected. She had always believed that change did not happen suddenly, but through small, persistent efforts made by individuals who refused to give up. And now she felt that belief growing stronger than ever. She started reaching out to people who followed her work, asking them questions about their experiences with online hate and cyberbullying, and the responses she received were more emotional than she expected. Many wrote about the pain of waking up to hateful messages about their appearance, their culture, their dreams, and even their families. Others described how online mobs tried to cancel them for small mistakes, how they felt isolated, how they lost confidence, and how they struggled to find safe spaces to breathe and recover. Reading these testimonies opened Aaliyah's eyes to how widespread the problem truly was. The digital world was supposed to connect humans, but for some, it had become a trap where voices were silenced, hearts were wounded, and bullies thrived without consequence. Aaliyah collected every story and kept them close because each voice reminded her why she could not walk away from this mission, no matter how overwhelming it felt. She then created a private online support group, inviting victims of cyberbullying from different parts of the world to join and share their experiences in a safe and moderated space. At first, only a few joined, but soon the group grew into hundreds, then thousands. People posted about their pain, but also their victories. They encouraged each other, offered advice, shared coping strategies, and reminded newcomers that they were not alone. In that space, strangers became allies, and allies became friends. Seeing the community flourish made Aaliyah realize that community was the antidote to isolation. She understood that the first step in healing from online hate was knowing that someone cared enough to listen, and someone cared enough to stand beside you without judgment. She felt proud that she had helped create a space like that, even if it was still small compared to the size of the internet. One day, Aaliyah was invited to speak at a virtual conference about digital well-being, mental health, and social responsibility. She felt nervous because it was her first time addressing a professional audience, but she accepted the invitation because she believed that silence would not protect anyone. She prepared for days, practicing her speech, taking notes, and imagining the faces of the people who would listen. When the day arrived, her voice trembled slightly at the beginning, but as she spoke, she remembered the stories of victims, the support messages, the online community, and all the reasons she started her journey. Her voice grew stronger, her words gained weight, and the audience listened quietly as she explained how online hate could shape identities, destroy careers, damage mental health, and push vulnerable individuals into dangerous emotional territory. She finished her speech to a wave of virtual applause, and the organizers thanked her privately afterward, telling her that her perspective was powerful because it came from lived experience, not just theory. Aaliyah felt a mix of relief and pride because she never imagined that her pain would become her strength or that her wounds would guide others toward healing rather than destruction. After that event, more invitations came from schools, youth groups, NGOs, and even small business organizations who wanted to learn how to protect their communities from digital harassment. Aaliyah attended each session with humility and purpose, always reminding herself that she was not seeking fame, but awareness and action. She taught students how to respond to cyberbullies, how to report harmful content, how to build resilience, and how to support friends who were struggling silently. Meanwhile, trolls continued to target her online, sending messages filled with mockery, insults, and threats. But Aaliyah felt differently now. Their words no longer entered the fragile parts of her mind the way they once did. Instead, she saw their behavior as a symptom of deeper societal issues, such as loneliness, frustration, insecurity, and the lack of accountability that digital platforms provided. She still felt anger sometimes, but she also felt understanding, and that understanding gave her clarity. She once told her online community that hate is loud because pain is loud, and many people who spread cruelty have no idea what to do with their own suffering, so they project it onto others. Her followers resonated with those words and shared them widely across social media, sparking conversations that surprised even Aaliyah. Over time, journalists began noticing her work, and some reached out to interview her for online magazines and podcasts. They wanted to understand how a young woman with no institutional backing had built a growing movement that encouraged kindness and accountability in digital spaces. Aaliyah agreed to the interviews because she knew that every bit of awareness mattered. Every article, every podcast, every mention could reach someone who needed it. As her influence grew, she understood that awareness was only the first stage of change. The next stage required structure, alliances, and long-term strategy. She needed partners, educators, mental health professionals, policy advocates, and youth ambassadors, because no movement could thrive on passion alone. It needed a framework that would survive beyond one person and one voice. So, Aaliyah drafted a list of organizations that worked in areas connected to her mission, such as mental health, cyber safety, online education, anti-bullying activism, and digital policy. She sent emails to dozens of them, describing her work, her goals, and her desire to collaborate. Some ignored her, but many replied warmly, inviting her to meetings and offering guidance, resources, and contacts to help her expand her efforts. Each meeting taught her new lessons about how systems worked, how campaigns were built, how funding was acquired, and how change was measured. She took notes on everything because she wanted her movement to be effective, not just emotional. She wanted results. She wanted schools to adopt anti-cyberbullying programs. She wanted social media platforms to take responsibility. She wanted victims to receive psychological support and legal protection. Aaliyah knew these goals would take years, but she did not fear the timeline because she was committed to the mission. One step at a time, she told herself, one voice at a time, one community at a time. Nothing big begins big. It grows. She believed those words deeply. Her movement still did not have an official name, but more and more people were calling it the Kindness Revolution, the Empathy Project, or the Digital Safe Space, or simply Aaliyah's mission. And although none of those were official titles, they reflected the spirit of what she had started. Time moved forward, and Alea felt the pace of her life change in ways she had never expected, as new opportunities and challenges appeared almost every day. Sometimes she felt overwhelmed by how quickly things were evolving, yet she reminded herself that every movement in history had begun with ordinary people who were willing to stand up even when they felt unprepared or afraid, and that thought gave her strength during moments of doubt. One morning, she received an email from a large youth organization that hosted international events in different countries. They invited her to speak at an upcoming virtual summit where young leaders from around the world would gather to discuss social issues, digital culture, and mental health. Alea read the email twice, then 3 times, her heart racing, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. She had never imagined that her journey would reach a global stage, but there it was, an invitation waiting for her response. She accepted and spent weeks preparing her presentation because she understood that her message had to be clear and powerful. She gathered research, statistics, personal stories from her community, and insights from experts she had met over the months. She organized everything into a story that showed not only the pain of online hate, but also the possibility of transformation through empathy, education, and collective responsibility. When the day of the summit arrived, Alea logged in and saw hundreds of participants from multiple countries, each with their cameras on and microphones muted, waiting for the first speaker. Her palms were sweaty and her heart thudded loudly, but she breathed deeply and whispered to herself that she was ready, because she was no longer speaking just for herself. She was speaking for every person who had been bullied, mocked, silenced, or erased by cruelty online. When her turn came, she began to speak, and her voice flowed steadily across the digital room. She talked about her own experiences, the messages she received from victims around the world, the rising rates of cyberbullying, and the psychological weight it imposed. She explained how digital harassment often led to real-world consequences, such as isolation, anxiety, self-harm, and in some cases, the loss of life. The audience listened silently, and some nodded with solemn expressions because they understood that this was not an abstract issue, but a lived reality for millions. Then she shifted to solutions, discussing how digital empathy, education, youth leadership, and cross-sector collaboration could create safer online spaces. She emphasized that kindness was not weakness, but strength, that accountability was not censorship, but responsibility, and that silence allowed hate to grow unchecked. Her words resonated deeply, and when she finished, the chat was filled with supportive messages, questions, and invitations for future collaboration. After the summit ended, Alea felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced before. She did not celebrate with loud cheers or dramatic gestures. Instead, she smiled quietly and allowed herself to savor the feeling of purpose that warmed her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Her journey was far from over, but she could see the path stretching ahead of her, and she knew she was walking in the right direction. In the following weeks, more people joined her online support community, and it became clear that the group needed structure to handle the growing number of members. So, Alea recruited volunteers from within the community, people who were compassionate, patient, and experienced with digital communication. She trained them to moderate discussions, guide newcomers, share mental health resources, and organize peer support sessions. The transformation was remarkable, and the group evolved from a loose gathering of survivors into a supportive network with dedicated roles and responsibilities. At the same time, Alea began developing educational materials that teachers, counselors, and parents could use to address cyberbullying in schools. She designed guides, worksheets, and conversation prompts focused on empathy, digital literacy, and emotional resilience. She shared them freely online because she believed knowledge should not be locked behind paywalls, especially when lives and well-being were at stake. One day, a teacher from another country messaged her, saying that her materials helped students open up about their online struggles for the first time. Some students admitted they had been bullied. Others confessed they had bullied others without fully understanding the harm, and some simply expressed the relief of knowing they were not alone. That message stayed with Alea for days because it showed her that awareness could ripple outward, changing hearts one classroom at a time. Meanwhile, journalists continued writing about her work, and eventually a major media outlet published an article calling her one of the leading voices in digital empathy advocacy. The article spread quickly, and people began reaching out to her from countries she had never visited, speaking languages she had never heard, yet all united by the same human desire for dignity and respect in online spaces. Despite the growing attention, Alea remained grounded. She still lived in the same small apartment, still drank tea from the same chipped mug, and still filmed videos under the same lamp clipped to the same shelf. She reminded herself that movements were not built on fame or glamour, but on persistence, compassion, and community. She was grateful for every person who believed in her message, and she never forgot that her journey had begun in a bedroom where she once felt small, fragile, and alone. As her movement expanded, people started to ask what they could call it because a mission without a name felt incomplete. Alea spent nights thinking about this because she wanted a name that captured the heart of the movement, not just its function. After many days of reflection, she finally chose a name: KindNet, a word that represented a network built on kindness instead of cruelty, a digital space where empathy connected people across borders and screens. The community embraced the name instantly, and soon people began adding KindNet to their bios, their posts, and their digital discussions. The hashtag spread organically, and it carried stories of transformation, acts of kindness, educational messages, and resources for survivors. It was simple, memorable, and powerful, just like the movement itself. As KindNet continued growing, Alea realized that her mission was no longer a personal project, but a collective force, and that understanding made her feel humbled and determined. She knew that the world was changing, slowly but surely, and even the loudest hate could be challenged by the persistent whisper of empathy if enough people joined their voices together. Months passed, and the movement grew faster than Alea had imagined or planned for, but even in the midst of rapid expansion, she reminded herself that the heart of KindNet was not speed or numbers, but people, real people whose daily lives were touched by the work she and her community were doing. She spent countless hours responding to messages from strangers, organizing online meetings, and helping moderators handle the emotional weight that came with supporting victims of online cruelty, because she never wanted any member of the movement to feel alone in their efforts. During this time, Alea received an invitation to collaborate with a nonprofit organization that focused on mental health support for youth across different regions. Their team wanted to integrate cyberbullying awareness into their programs and believed that KindNet could provide the lived experience perspective that their curriculum lacked. Alea agreed to the partnership and soon found herself working alongside psychologists, educators, and youth leaders who shared her vision for a safer digital world. Together, they designed workshops that combined emotional learning with practical digital safety strategies. Some sessions taught young people how to recognize digital harassment and report it. Others taught them how to support friends who were being targeted. Others focused on building inner resilience and self-worth so that hateful words did not take root inside vulnerable hearts. The combination of expertise and lived experiences made the workshops powerful, and participants consistently described them as eye-opening, transformative, and healing. Alea attended as many workshop sessions as her schedule allowed, and each time she listened to young participants share their stories with trembling voices, tears, nervous laughter, and quiet strength. Some had been attacked by online mobs because of their appearance. Some had been mocked for their accents or their interests. Some had been pressured into silence by fear of retaliation. Hearing these stories reminded Alea why she had chosen this path, because every story was a reflection of her own pain at the beginning of her journey, and every voice was a reminder that change was still needed. Meanwhile, KindNet was no longer just online. People began organizing local meetups in community centers, libraries, and cafes, where they discussed digital kindness and mental health, shared personal experiences, and planned awareness campaigns. Some created posters to display in schools, some made videos for social media, some designed art pieces that represented healing and resilience. Aaliyah watched these initiatives unfold with admiration because it showed her that the movement had evolved beyond her individual leadership and had become a shared mission that others were willing to carry. However, not everything was smooth and hopeful. Trolls continued targeting Aaliyah and her community members, sometimes mocking their mission and sometimes accusing them of being naive or weak. Other times, coordinated hate groups attempted to disrupt KindNet spaces by infiltrating support groups and posting harmful messages. The moderators acted quickly to remove them, but these incidents reminded Aaliyah that cruelty would not disappear simply because empathy existed. It had to be challenged continuously and with strategic defenses. Instead of letting these attacks discourage her, Aaliyah used them as case studies for the movement, analyzing how trolls organized, how platforms responded, and how victims were affected. She worked with allies to create safety protocols for support groups, such as admission screening, moderator training, resource sharing, and crisis escalation plans. She also developed simple guides teaching community members how to secure their accounts, block harassers, document abuse, and seek legal or institutional support when necessary. Around this time, Aaliyah was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include KindNet in a film about the rise of digital activism. The filmmaker traveled to interview Aaliyah in person, and for the first time, Aaliyah found herself in front of a professional camera, recounting the earliest days of her journey, the moment hate nearly silenced her, and the way she transformed that moment into the foundation of a global movement. The experience felt surreal, but also liberating, because she no longer felt ashamed of her vulnerability. Instead, she felt proud that her pain had given birth to something that protected others. When the documentary was released months later, it gained international attention, and KindNet saw another wave of new members, journalists, educators, and policymakers reaching out to learn more. Aaliyah felt a mix of excitement and responsibility because she knew that increased visibility meant increased scrutiny, as well as increased power to influence positive change. During one virtual conference that took place shortly after the documentary release, Aaliyah was asked a question that lingered in her mind for many days. A student from another country asked how she handled the emotional burden of witnessing so much suffering and whether she ever felt like giving up. The question was sincere and gentle, and Aaliyah paused before answering because she wanted to speak truth, not performance. She finally responded by saying that she did feel the weight sometimes, and that there were days when she cried alone, when the stories became too heavy, or when trolls became too aggressive. But she always remembered that giving up would not make the world kinder, and that silence had never protected anyone from hate. She explained that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, and that movements were built not by perfect leaders, but imperfect humans who cared deeply. Her answer stayed with many attendees, and later it became one of the most shared quotes associated with KindNet, appearing on posters, banners, and online posts that encouraged others to keep fighting for empathy despite exhaustion or doubt. As the movement matured, Aaliyah noticed that policymakers were beginning to discuss digital harassment in more serious terms. Some governments held hearings about digital safety laws and invited activists, researchers, and educators to testify. Aaliyah was invited too, and although she felt intimidated at first, she understood her voice represented millions of people who had suffered in silence, so she accepted the responsibility with humility and determination. At the hearing, she spoke about how platforms needed clearer reporting mechanisms, how victims needed legal protection, how schools needed updated digital education, and how cultural norms needed to shift from ridicule to respect. Her words were recorded, broadcast, and debated, and even though the hearing didn't solve everything, it marked a significant step forward because the issue was no longer invisible or ignored. Through all of this, Aaliyah continued creating content for her original followers, who had supported her from the beginning. She recorded videos late at night, sharing lessons she learned, new updates from the movement, personal reflections about healing, and stories of hope from community members. She believed that movements needed both large-scale structural change and intimate personal connection, because one without the other would not last. Even though her life had become busy and sometimes chaotic, Aaliyah never forgot the girl she once was, the girl who wanted to delete her account because strangers spat hate across her screen. She carried that memory like a compass, reminding her to lead with authenticity, compassion, and purpose. She knew that fame was fleeting, but impact was lasting, and she chose impact every single time. With each passing season, KindNet transformed from a growing initiative into a recognized force for digital kindness and online safety. Aaliyah found herself navigating a world that balanced emotional work, strategic planning, and public advocacy all at the same time. She learned how to speak with policymakers, how to collaborate with institutions, and how to engage audiences from different cultures and backgrounds. While doing all of this, she never allowed the movement to lose sight of the human stories at its center, because she knew stories were the heartbeat of KindNet and the reason it existed at all. One evening, while Aaliyah was reviewing emails, she received a message from a mother whose teenage son had taken his life months earlier as a result of relentless online harassment. The mother thanked Aaliyah for giving language to a pain that most families had no words for, and for fighting for changes that could prevent other young people from suffering in silence. Reading that message shook Aaliyah deeply. She closed her laptop and sat quietly on her bed for a long time, tears falling as she held her hand over her mouth to keep herself from sobbing out loud. She did not feel hopeless, but she felt the gravity of the battle they were fighting, and she knew that the movement was about more than awareness. It was about saving lives. After that night, Aaliyah pushed harder for collaborations with mental health professionals and legal advocates. She wanted a world where victims of online hate could receive immediate psychological support, where parents could recognize signs of digital struggle, where communities could intervene early, and where platforms would take responsibility for harassment instead of ignoring it for profits or convenience. She also wanted schools to include digital empathy as seriously as academic subjects, because young people needed tools, not just lectures. Over time, KindNet formed alliances with mental health helplines, legal aid networks, educational platforms, and youth organizations. These partnerships created a web of support across countries so that victims who reached out to KindNet could be connected to help quickly instead of being left alone in emotional distress. Aaliyah felt hopeful as these connections formed because she understood that real change required collective effort, not individual heroism. Around this time, Aaliyah was invited to speak at a major international conference on technology and society, attended by scholars, tech executives, human rights activists, and government ministers. The event was known for shaping global discussions on digital policy, and Aaliyah was one of the youngest speakers selected. When she stepped onto the stage, her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve was unshakable. She spoke with clarity and urgency, describing the psychological effects of hate speech, the failures of platform moderation, the absence of legal protection for victims, and the moral responsibility of tech companies to build humane systems rather than harmful ones. Her speech received a standing ovation, and afterward, several experts approached her, offering guidance and support. One professor offered to help her design a research paper on digital empathy. One policy advisor invited her to contribute to international safety guidelines. One executive from a major tech company scheduled a meeting to discuss building safer reporting tools and anti-harassment detection systems. Aaliyah realized that the conversation had finally shifted from awareness to action, and that shift was monumental. Even as her professional influence expanded, Aaliyah stayed deeply connected to the grassroots of KindNet. She still joined community circles, listened to survivors, moderated sessions when moderators were overwhelmed, and sent supportive voice notes to members going through difficult periods. She believed that leaders should walk among their people, not above them, and that belief kept her grounded. During one particularly emotional session, a young boy confessed that he had bullied others online because he himself had been bullied in real life. He cried as he admitted that hurting others made him feel powerful temporarily, but guilty afterward. The community responded with compassion instead of condemnation and helped him explore healthier ways to cope with his pain. That moment showed Aaliyah that empathy could transform not only victims, but also perpetrators, because no one was born cruel, and many needed guidance rather than punishment. This realization inspired Aaliyah to create a new branch of KindNet focused on rehabilitating digital aggressors through education, empathy building, conflict resolution, and psychological support. She believed that long-term change required not just defending against hate, but transforming the roots that fed it. Over time, this branch showed promising results as former trolls and bullies came forward to share how the program helped them unlearn harmful behaviors and understand the impact of their actions. Of course, not everyone approved of this approach. Some critics accused Aaliyah of being too soft on bullies and argued that strict punishment was the only way to stop harassment. Aaliyah understood their frustration, but she believed that punishment alone could not change hearts, and that changed hearts were necessary to create a kinder digital world. She responded to critics calmly by saying that justice and empathy were not opposites, and that society needed both if it wanted lasting solutions. In the midst of these developments, Aaliyah received an invitation that carried profound significance. The United Nations organization that focused on digital rights and youth empowerment invited her to join a global task force aimed at protecting young people from online violence and digital exploitation. The task force included experts from different continents and diverse fields, and Aaliyah was the youngest member by far. When she read the invitation, she sat in silence, staring at the screen with disbelief and gratitude flooding her senses. Accepting the invitation meant stepping onto a platform that could shape international policies and influence national laws around the world. It also meant carrying the voices of millions into rooms where powerful decisions were made. Aaliyah knew she was ready, not because she had all the answers, but because she had lived the questions and listened to the cries of those who suffered without support. During task force meetings, Aaliyah advocated relentlessly for victims, emphasizing the importance of mental health support, crisis intervention, platform accountability, and global education. She shared stories without identifying individuals, protecting their privacy while amplifying their struggles. Her contributions earned respect from senior members who once underestimated her because of her age, but soon realized that her experience was invaluable because it represented lived reality rather than detached theory. As the months passed, the task force drafted recommendations for international standards that would require countries to adopt cyber safety policies, protect minors from harassment, regulate harmful algorithms, and ensure access to mental health services for victims. Aaliyah knew that policy change was slow and complex, but she felt encouraged because these conversations had not existed years earlier when she first faced hate alone in her bedroom. In the midst of all this growth, Aaliyah began to reflect on her personal transformation. She had started as a girl who cried silently behind a screen, feeling small and powerless. Now, she stood as a leader who influenced global conversations, built networks across nations, and empowered others to fight for kindness, fairness, and dignity. She did not become fearless, but she became brave, and bravery was enough. Even with her achievements, Aaliyah never assumed the journey was complete. She knew there was still much to do, and that the final outcome depended not on her alone, but on every person who joined the movement. She often reminded the community that KindNet was not her story, but their story, and that the world would change only if enough hearts chose empathy instead of cruelty. As KindNet approached its third-year celebrations, members from dozens of countries organized virtual and physical events to honor the progress they had made and to renew their commitment to the mission. The events included art exhibitions, panel discussions, youth debates, music performances, storytelling nights, and community walks. Each event carried messages of resilience, hope, and unity. Aaliyah attended as many as she could, and each one made her emotional because the movement she once dreamt of in isolation had become a reality shared by thousands. The night before the main celebration, Aaliyah sat alone on her balcony, looking at the city lights shimmering in the distance. The air was cool and the sky was clear, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the journey. The suffering that started it, the resistance that shaped it, the compassion that fueled it, and the dreams that kept it alive. She closed her eyes and whispered that she was grateful for every wound, every tear, and every moment of doubt, because without them, there would be no KindNet, no community, and no global push for digital kindness. The day of the global KindNet celebration arrived, and Aaliyah felt a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and profound gratitude as she prepared to address thousands of members online from different countries, ages, and backgrounds. She knew that the journey had been long, filled with moments of doubt, struggle, and fear, but now it had reached a point where the collective energy of the community radiated hope and strength across screens, borders, and hearts alike. She logged into the virtual hall early and watched participants join from distant cities, some with cameras on, others with avatars representing their presence. All carried a story, a struggle, a reason for being part of KindNet, and Aaliyah felt their presence like a gentle wave lifting her spirits. She smiled quietly because she realized that she was no longer speaking for herself or for a few followers. She was speaking for an entire network of human hearts determined to reclaim digital spaces from cruelty and hatred. When the event began, speakers shared their experiences and achievements. Young leaders spoke about programs they had launched, survivors shared stories of resilience, teachers explained lessons learned, and advocates presented new strategies for policy change. Each segment built upon the last, creating a mosaic of triumph, hope, and learning that reinforced the power of collective action. Finally, Aaliyah stepped onto the virtual stage, and she took a deep breath, remembering the girl who once cried silently behind a phone, feeling helpless and unseen. She began to speak, recounting her journey from vulnerability to advocacy, from isolation to leadership, from fear to courage. She spoke honestly about the pain of online hate, the struggle to persist, and the lessons learned about empathy, compassion, and human connection. She highlighted the power of community, reminding everyone that KindNet was not a single person's achievement, but a movement fueled by countless individuals who dared to care. She spoke about the successes, the survivors empowered, the bullies transformed, the classrooms changed, the policies influenced, and the digital spaces made safer. She reminded everyone that every small act of kindness, every supportive message, every shared story contributed to a ripple effect that reached far beyond what anyone could see. Aaliyah concluded her speech with a simple message that carried the weight of all the years of struggle and growth. Be brave. Be kind. Stand up for those who cannot yet speak, and remember that your voice matters more than the noise of hate. Even if you feel small, your actions have power. Even if the world seems cruel, you can create change. And even if darkness surrounds you, you can be the light. The applause from thousands of participants echoed through the virtual hall, and messages flooded the chat, expressing gratitude, admiration, inspiration, and renewed commitment. Aaliyah felt tears in her eyes because she realized that the moment was bigger than her, bigger than KindNet, bigger than any single achievement. It was the embodiment of what could happen when humans chose empathy over indifference and action over silence. After the celebration, Alia reflected on the journey from the lonely days when she considered giving up to the present when her movement had grown into a global force. She thought about the trolls who tried to silence her and realized that without them, she might never have discovered the strength she carried within or the power of her voice. She thought about the victims who reached out to her and how their courage to share transformed her mission. She thought about every volunteer, every supporter, every participant, and knew that the movement would continue growing long after she was gone. Months later, KindNet expanded into new regions, establishing local chapters supported by trained volunteers, educators, and mental health professionals. Alia continued to mentor new leaders, helping them navigate challenges and encouraging them to maintain the heart of the movement even as it scaled. She remained humble because she understood that leadership was service and that the success of KindNet depended on collective dedication, not personal glory. Alia also took time for personal reflection, allowing herself moments of quiet gratitude, joy, and peace. She visited her favorite places, walked in nature, read books that inspired, journaled about her experiences, and stayed connected to her own emotions. She knew that caring for oneself was essential to sustaining care for others, and that resilience required balance, mindfulness, and self-compassion. Years later, when people looked back on the history of KindNet, they saw a story that began with one young woman facing hate alone and ended with a global network of compassion and action that transformed digital spaces. They remembered how courage had turned pain into purpose, how vulnerability had turned into leadership, and how one voice had multiplied into thousands, inspiring a culture of empathy, kindness, and responsibility that would continue to grow for generations. Alia continued to inspire through her words, actions, and example, showing the world that even in the face of cruelty, determination, empathy, and courage could create lasting change. She knew that the journey of advocacy was never truly over, because new challenges would always arise. But she also knew that humanity had the capacity to rise to them when guided by compassion. And so the story of the young woman who faced online hate and built a global movement came full circle, from fear to hope, from isolation to community, from vulnerability to strength. Her legacy was not only in the policies changed, the programs implemented, or the awards received, but in every heart she touched, every life she impacted, and every act of kindness that continued to ripple across the world, proving that hate could be transformed into hope, and that one determined voice could ignite a global movement.